Hi, welcome back. I'm Terry Burns, and this is a continuation of my course on the Monas Hieroglyphica or Hieroglyphic Monad of Dr. John Dee. And yes, I am still using the translation that I did with Nancy Turner that came out from Ouroboros Press a couple of years ago. The link for that is below if you're interested in a physical copy, but I will also provide you everything you need here on your screen. Those of you who have been studying along with me all this time know that we are closing in on the end of the Hieroglyphic Monad. We're up to Theorem 22, and my intention is to finish the theorems themselves by January. There are other things I'd like to talk to you about after that, but the theorems themselves I want to have finished by the end of January. So this is the third installment of class 22 on Theorem 22, and there actually will be two more videos after this, but what we're going to do here is understand Dee's alchemical diagram in his second grade of the moon. Now, I want to apologize. A few of you got an early version of this where I had forgotten a whole section that I wanted to discuss. That's pretty important if you're looping back, and this is the logical place to bring it in. So I've re-recorded this whole class. But for those of you who are just joining us for the first time, this is an advanced class, and by now it's gotten to be a really advanced class because I'm not only assuming that you know who John Dee is and that you know what the Monas Hieroglyphica is, I'm assuming that you have read and understood through Theorem 21 and you're trying to understand Theorem 22, which is the most difficult theorem in the Hieroglyphic Monad. I'm also assuming that with help, you can pick up references to texts that an educated humanist of Dee's era would know. So probably not the best place to jump in, but I would love to have you in this course, would absolutely love it. There are 4 different playlists below that'll get you up to speed. And also those of you who maybe caught the beginning but are just tuning back in now, something has changed after Theorem 20. The world symbolically ended. That's a pretty big change, and we got his vision of heavenly Jerusalem. But there are also from Theorem 21 on, a lot more references to his sort of what I take as his secret text, Codex Marcianus Graecus 299. I've talked about that in now 4 supplementary videos. It started back in 15 with Isis the prophetess to her son Horus, but then after 21, we've looked at the works of Zosimos of Panopolis and his whole vision of alchemical transformation and on the letter Omega. So I'll drop in links to those if anyone is interested. What he's doing here is laying out an initiatory structure. That's what we are talking about from 21 on, and basically in 21 and 22, because as I've pointed out before, after 22, things just sort of end. 23 is pretty long, but it's basically drafting instructions, and that big map that you have there, you will find is fairly easy to figure out on your own, although I will go over it. Remember what went on in 21 then. Dee was laying out his twofold grades of the moon. And this symbol over here, E, connected to his twofold grades of the moon. The first of those grades, he broke out into 4 subgrades, which we talked about. But the most important sort of takeaway from that is that by 21, you realize you are the vessel, or in the vessel, if you want to get graphic about it per Zosimos of Panopolis, you're in the vessel being transformed, and you're being transformed by the signs and symbols that you meditate upon. That's the idea of revelation in angel magic. You are maybe contemplating whatever is associated with a particular sephira or something like that, just in an exactly similar way to how the Pythagoreans would think about numbers and contemplate them. In fact, those 2 ideas are totally overlapped in the work of Dee. Okay, so that this is the path of the initiate has become very obvious by 22. And remember, he's using the word vessel for one thing. And the other thing is the word in Latin for vessel, vas, can mean a tool. It can also mean in a double sense. So what are you working with? You're working with your astral body, your light body, while your feet are still firmly on the ground in Malkuth. In fact, in Malkuth of Malkuth, because we've now brought in the whole concept of 4 worlds, right? So also, you can use the metaphor from Zosimos of Panopolis's on the letter Omega, if you would like, that you are like the man Phos, and this is your light body. All right, so the idea is you're transforming yourself. by exposing yourself to emanations of divine light as you move up the pillar of the tree of life, or at least the middle pillar of the fourth world, Asaya. And we saw from remembering how you had projected the elements, the different, not elements, pardon me, different planetary glyphs upon the tree of life back in Theorem 13 and continued using them actually overtly through 15, and now we're using them again now. So the way that you projected Venus upon the tree of life matches that symbol he gave you, E, right? And if you make it, shrink it down, so it's just in the world of Asaya, his 4 grades are the bottom here. They're lunar grades that are circling around Yesod associated with the moon and silver. One of the other things that you can think of, since we are going to see something that looks like a reflecting mirror here, is that since silver is associated with Yesod, what do you use silver to make, among other things? Reflecting mirrors. So metaphorically, we're thinking also of as Yesod in Asaya as reflecting the upper part of the tree, at least in Asaya. These are the graphics that you made back when you were doing that in the earlier theorems. Remember in 21, you were also instructed to go back to the beginning and with wiser meditations, work through the whole thing again. I would suspect most of you haven't had time to do that, but one of the things that becomes more apparent the second time that I haven't really talked about because it's not necessary for a first explanation, but was the role of Mars on the tree of life. Modern Hermetic groups still use these 2 signs, right? But Mars, probably because our symbol for Mars is different from the one that Dee decided he was going to use. Mars on the tree of life isn't used that much. But think of how you can interpret this now. I mean, here you have his Aries glyph as initiating fire, and you know why Aries is associated with fire. You know why it is associated with the beginning of time, Aries of Aries, and you know why you would associate fire with divine light or its reflection that is propelling you up the tree to where? Yesod. So shrink that down into the fourth world, also now that you have that concept, and you can see that glyph as being the active process of initiation. Also with this Mercury glyph, which is going to be important in this theorem, remember back in theorems 12, 13, Dee was working with 4 different variations of the Mercury glyph. And one of them, if you look down here, has his little Aries symbol because it is in effect the entire glyph of the Monas without the little dot in the middle. Okay, oh, well, wait, that can't be right. We'll see what isn't right here in a minute. So if Venus on the tree of life is his 2 grades of the moon, remember how he had the omegas, right? So you can have another circle here and you can make it 2 circles that are touching at Tifereth of Asaya. We're also going to remember, though, that in 21, this part of it was one of the many times he's flipped the monad and what that indicates. And you know what that means now. So I won't repeat all of it. But since you know what that means now, you can look at this glyph of, you can't just project Mercury upside down on the tree of life and flip it the way you can flip the monad. You're going to need to attribute it to other Sephiroth. In fact, your homework for this will be 2 things: to do something that is a kind of semi-repeat of 13, project Mercury upside down onto the tree of life as the world is forming, because that's what this was representing, and then to explain that chart that you get in 22. All right. And if you recognize this work that you had before when you were supposed to be attributing the different planets to different Sephiroth and Mercury on the tree of life and so on, that's a good place to look to work through this. Here are his 4 Mercury glyphs. There's one of them down here. There's one of them up here. And here it is in Mercury is in the middle. Okay, and you have this whole loaded graphic over here. And now on this side is Mars, on this side is Venus. One of the things that was introduced in Theorem 15 that becomes very important by the end of this theorem is the idea of the sacred marriage. And remember how that was expressed as a kind of merging with the divine. And we talked about that also with Isis the prophetess to her son Horus. Well, you can see that, for example, Venus and Mars they're not exactly mirroring each other like these two that are representing Saturn and Jupiter or Kesed and Geburah are, but they are opposite. And if you think of them in modern terms as active and passive, in Dee's terms, he and other Rosicrucians are associating it with feminine and masculine. You can see that that's a way of bringing the ideas of active and passive energy together. All right, more on that. And when I say Rosicrucian, I know the Rosicrucian era really starts after D. We're going to look at that as when we try to solve those interesting letters that are hard to read in Theorem 22. But you can also apply it backwards to works that D has, like the Rosarium Philosophorum in particular, where you'll get two groups of sacred marriages and so on. All right, so let's move on here. We are going to get back to Theorem 22. My first inclination when I was studying this was to think, all right, well, we know that E, Venus on the tree of life, is his first grade of the moon divided into 4 subgrades, and why. So we want to use Mercury now, right, and make it small. And then we'll have 4 upper grades of the moon. And you can do that if you want. It makes, in ways, more sense to keep Venus, since he actually says in 21, Venus on the tree of life is what he's doing. But let's take just a minute and examine that, because it's actually an important question, not if you're just intellectually going through the monad, but if you're trying to work this out as a system yourself. So we're going to leave Venus there because he indicated that's his artificial vessel. Look, I'm being like D and repeating everything twice. But I want to digress here because there are some of you out there probably who are adepts in initiatory orders and have reached a level that would be considered the second order. And in trying to see how much that idea of a second order overlaps with D's second grade of the moon is a fascinating endeavor. If anyone wants to share their thoughts below, I'd love to hear about them. I would assume many of you have things that you can teach me about it, and hopefully I've taught you some things here. So symbolically, this Mercury on the tree of life or Venus on the tree of life matches a kind of contemporary discussion I've sometimes had as part of 2 different and totally unrelated magical orders, which is whether the grade of Adeptus, the second order, could extend beyond the abyss or above Dot on the great tree. Now, it would seem to me not, for a variety of reasons, until you realize you're talking about the tree in the world of Asaya, and then of course it can. What you can't do, though, if you make Mercury the second one, is overlap it out. It doesn't work very well once you leave the world of Asaya for a variety of reasons. And I'm not going to weigh in on that one way or the other here, except to repeat my speculation that Dee's initiatory path structure had to be an influence, maybe not the influence, or maybe the influence, but at least an influence upon the original 1880s Golden Dawn and their cipher manuscript, because you can see so many parallels going on. Now, that whether that is through Rosicrucianism or some other way, I'd say it was direct oral teaching of the Monas Hieroglyphica. That's just my personal opinion. But also, I want to add in, however you set up this structure, and I'm just leaving it as Venus on the tree of life. One reason is Venus is particularly special to D. Also, he thinks he's living in the age of Venus. That is also another whole discussion. But the important thing is going to be, if you're using this as more than just intellectual gymnastics, that what becomes important is what are you meditating upon that is going to cause these changes to happen. we've already seen from the vision of Zosimos, which had to be an influence on him, or his association of the crucifixion of Jesus, which crucifixion let us, you know, one would not want to be crucified, but it gets equated with the process one is going through. So what is the content that is going to cause that? And do you really want to go through it? Anyway, we're also going to see by the time we end this theorem how Mercury on the tree of life can indicate a couple other important things, which would seem to be very important since the whole monad glyph is a stylized Mercury that he's been flipping around. And that's also why I'm going to be asking you, as I have mentioned, to project upside down monad glyph Mercury on the tree of life. Okay, enough about that. Let's get started with looking at his alchemical workshop in Theorem 22. What I want to do, since it's rather hard to, he says everything here twice, but even saying it twice, this is the most difficult theorem. So let's just read through it and look at what all these letters might mean. He says we point out that alpha is a kind of artificial vessel assuredly made from A and B, with both manifesting again a common radius from the line M, that's the radius of B and A, both manifesting again a common radius from the line M itself. As you see, alpha differs from the first letter of the Greek alphabet only in the local metathesis of its parts. So we had a whole video talking about what the different things metathesis could mean. So it's just you're switching components around, but you're not changing the component themselves. That is to say, once again, as we first taught, that true and mystical symmetry of the straight line, circle, and half circle. Granted, above we pointed out that it can be made from a circle and half circle. All of these return to the same mystical proposition, and he's said this twice, as he tends to do. Remember, vessel, vas can mean in a double sense. Okay, and lambda and delta. All right, this weird little thing here is his delta. There's a lambda. Lambda and delta assuredly at first are nearly like images of other vessels. Lambda indeed like one made of glass and delta like one made of earth. But in the second place, lambda and delta can remind us of a kind of pestle and mortar, right? Something you grind things with, which have been made out of a kind of material, truly, that has been prepared so we can grind into very fine powders, unblemished artificial pearls, crystalline lamans and beryls, topaz rubies, then precious carbuncles and other most rare and artificial stones. All right, lambda and delta. He repeats those multiple times too. In fact, he says lambda and delta twice, and then he talks about them separately twice, so 4 times total. But I want to talk about lambda as a glass vessel, because the word glass or glassy as an adjective in Latin, vitreous, is often used also for anything glass-like, for crystal, and it's an alchemical term. So vitreous earth, for example, since we're talking about delta as earth, vitreous earth was thought to lend solidity to matter, but it's a product of fire. It's like you make it with volcanic rock. So that solidity it lends to matter gives way if you put it under a high heat. And you can see what the mortar and pestle is. That's what a mortar and pestle look like if you haven't heard of one before. But then we might ask, why are these beautiful stones or a beautiful crystal laman? Why grind them up? And also, why are they artificial and doubled? And what about that powder? Is that the projecting powder? Why, yes, it is. There's the projecting powder. Now you can begin your quest for the Philosopher's Stone, as long as you're talking about a spiritual quest and you're not trying to change lead into gold. Yeah, he's saying that is the projection powder, and you can quickly guess one reason why that is, probably because these things all reflect light. And so if you imagine that light has permeated them and you're going to free that light from matter, that's what you might do, grind them up. But since he's grinding up such beautiful stones, let's take them in order and look at what they might mean, because they're actually packed with meaning. They all reflect light, like I said. The mortar, if we switch metaphors here, can be a mirror. One way you make mirrors, by the way, since in understanding this, we already have moved up to Yesod of Asaya, right? Treasure house of images, and it may be reflecting above. It may be a silver reflecting mirror. And we've talked about parabolas and mirrors, how they can ignite things and fire things up, like firing up this vitreous earth, perhaps. But if we go through here in order, the very first one, an artificial pearl, it just cries out as a symbol. First of all, there aren't artificial pearls in the West Indies time. But if there were, they'd be really expensive. It would indeed be a pearl of great price, which of course is going to direct us to that parable of the pearl of great price in the book of Matthew. Remember, Dee is a pious Christian, even if you or I might or might not be, but Dee certainly is. So the idea there is the kingdom of heaven is like a merchant seeking beautiful pearls who, when he had found one pearl of great price, went and sold all that he had and bought it. The kingdom of heaven is equated to a pearl of great price. And in the D universe, you can see even more reasons why this would be, because maybe an artificial pearl would be perfectly spherical, and that's the perfect form, and all kinds of other reasons you can find yourself. It's also the pearl is a title of a work that Dee would know well. There's a medieval poem called The Pearl, and it's found in a set of manuscripts with Sir Gawain and the Green Knight and a couple others. It winds up in the Cotton Library. The Cottons are friends of Dee, and not only that, they're the people who, after Dee dies, the son of one of the Cottons goes digging in Dee's yard, and that's how we get some of his later conversations with angels kind of manuscript. But anyway, in this poem, The Pearl, it's a very long, as I said, medieval poem, but it is the most numerically dense dream vision, and I think probably the most numerically dense poem in the English language. The idea is that this poet has lost his pearl of great price, and so this young maiden appears. By the end, you learn that she's the pearl of great price. She is the bride of Christ, the image of the divine, energetically kind of merging with the pearl poet after a lot of other things happen in that poem, which you can read about. I mean, she says that the pearl is a rose, and you have linked all the Rosicrucian stuff. Jesus has taken her as a queen. Of course, she calls Jesus the Lamb. And in a certain way, you can read that poem as going through the Rosicrucian later process if you want to. But that's all I'm going to say about the pearl. It's screaming as a symbol. Let's look at his lamen. A lamen is kind of a flat sheet. Sometimes name tags are lamens. If you are doing angel magic with Dean Kelly's later work, you know there's a protective lamen. This lamen is a crystal lamen. Wow. And barrels are often used for scrying, and that means that we're being directed back to his letter of Maximilian, because he talked about barrel gazers back in that letters, if you remember. And if you remember what he said there, wow, you're awesome, or else you have an eidetic memory or both. I wouldn't remember something we talked about that long ago, and even looking for it, I'd rather hear it again. So let's go through that quote from the letter to Maximilian, just in case we don't remember it perfectly. In the letter to Maximilian, when Dee is talking about all these different professions that would benefit from understanding his monad, he says, the barrel gazer may, in the crystal lamen, most exactly discern all of the celestial signs which are handled under the figure of the moon, whether in earth or water, and will explore all the regions of air and fire in a carbuncle or red stone. And D there you see is calling the monad itself a crystal lamen. And referring to a carbuncle, we'll get to that. But do you remember something unusual about red here? Nancy and I translated it as red, but he's writing it out in Hebrew as Alpha Dalet Mem. And that is how you would write Adam or red earth. And there's all kinds of plays with that in Hebrew. It's red, but it's more than red. Okay, In the same quote, carbuncle can mean either a small glowing piece of coal, like maybe you ground up the coal to fire things, or it can mean a ruby. In this quote, he gives us both a carbuncle and a ruby. But a ruby is one of the 12 foundation stones on the breastplate of the priest in Exodus, in Ezekiel, in Revelation. So that's gonna, and you can also use it for crystal gazing for that matter. So that's going to leave topaz, which seems in ways like the least, but you know, we talked about the least becoming the first and all that. So let's do that with topaz. Topaz in Dee's era isn't what topaz is today. Topaz then is referring to things mined in Topazios, which is St. John's Island. Yeah, that's St. John of the Apocalypse in the Red Sea. Yeah, the biblical Red Sea. So chrysolite is the main thing mined there. It's sometimes called peridot. Chrysolite is a yellowish crystal substance. And if you're doing physical alchemy, you can dissolve it in a solvent and you have a way of coloring something in yellow or gold. Remember the whole idea we talked about becoming gold, which is spiritual gold. So in, say, the vision of Zosimos, Sherwood Taylor, who was a great researcher of physical alchemy back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, wrote about how that process works. And as recent a person as Shannon Grimes talks about how in that vision, that could be a lead copper alloy, and you could, by subjecting it to different types of physical alchemy, turn it silver and turn it gold, even though the chemical composition doesn't change. Chrysolite just colors things gold. It makes something look like it's gold plated. And so it's interesting, in the book of Revelation, chrysolite is the seventh precious stone used to create the foundation of New Jerusalem. St. John is living in the same time period as this great fusion going on in Alexandria. So unless we want to be totally doctrinaire about scripture, which I have no interest in being, it's easy to assume a similar thing is going on there with what is going on in Greco-Egyptian Hebraic Christianized alchemy, like we have talked about in those works of Zosimos, that having it being the seventh precious stone to create the foundation of New Jerusalem is saying that that foundation is gold or colored gold or representing high spiritual attainment. And remember, that is supposed to be existing while you're still alive, even though most people are not aware of it. All right, we're going to keep going on here. A shout out to my friend Helen Perala next year, who asked a couple of videos ago about why there are all the A's and artificials in this theorem. I'll talk about the A's more when I get to that strange bit of text in 22. I'm going to do that in the next video. But let's talk about artificial here. We have an artificial vessel, we have artificial pearls, artificial stones. In Theorem 21, he told us that, let us then remember first that this solar grade is not made by nature, but that it's artificial and factitious. Factitious just means artificial. In other words, this whole process is artificial or done by art or artifice in a certain way. Let's look at the line that comes after this in 21. He had said the moon, existing and alive, is to be managed by the magisterial art of the element, since it has the power to represent the fullness of the sun when its half circles are joined together by art. So it represents the fullness of the sun. It is not the sun of the physical world, because in effect it's the bonds of the four elements that D is trying to break when this center point of the rectilinear cross, the stone the builder rejected, is merged with the center of his symbol for Tifereth for gold and so forth. All right, so they're joined together by art. We saw that in 21 also, and we see it again here. The two omegas come together, they look like the sun. The solar grade would be grades associated with Tifereth. So that's definitely something we're going to talk about with his second grade, their Tiferetic grades. So let's rephrase all of this based upon what we know to this point. This entire initiatory process he's describing is done by art or artifice, but it isn't natural. In fact, It's not natural and it's painful. But in nature, things tend to disorder and decay, and in this process, it is reordering and revivifying. He's describing a process of refining oneself, refiring oneself, anointing oneself, however you want to put it. So that involves 2 grades of the moon, as we know. The moon represents or can represent the sun, SON, SUN, gold, Tiferet, series of other associations when the half circles are joined. So he represented this by a glyph that was Venus on the tree of life and the 2 omegas close together. So where do we see that now? Down here. In other words, you're far enough through the process that you recognize what is going on at this point. He's describing a process that is near the end of D here, or in fact, centered on what would be B there, Tiferet of Asaya. So hold that thought, and we are going to look at his Greek letters in this little diagram, which you can recognize also. What is this? This is the light coming down the middle pillar of the tree, and here is his solar grade. But what else about these? Well, why is he going to associate lambda and delta with the mortar and pestle? Now, we can cheat here and solve it with English homophones if we want to. We'll do it the right way using the language he's writing in, Latin, and his other 2 sacred languages, Greek and Hebrew, in a moment. But let's just cheat, since we know what he's describing is some process for going up the middle pillar of the tree. What if we say he picked lambda because of the Lamb of God, like the pearl, the Pearl Maiden talks about, or Agnus Dei, Jesus as the Lamb of God. And we say, oh, this is the light of the Lamb of God, which would be associated with Tiferet, coming down and burning away the dross. Okay, that'd work. We can make this GD here with no O in the middle because that's been displaced. We could, I mean, that's how even today that Orthodox Jews writing God in English will put G space D because you don't write out God. So we're progressing up and getting more refined, higher, more refined emanations of God's light. All right, so that'll work in English, but let's do it the way we're supposed to do it in his sacred languages. Why he picks delta is something that we'll come back to in a moment. But I hope that if last time I asked you to study this diagram that you noticed something here, that V and X, what was that important in his LVX, light of the cross, LVX being Latin for light, right? That was his central symbol, his crux of the matter. And the problem with this V and X is there's no L, but lambda is the Latin L. Same place in the alphabet, same order in the alphabet. In fact, almost all the letters in Greek and Latin fall in the same order, except for a few. One of them is gamma, which I'm going to get to in a moment here. All right, so having VX with no L is just kind of useless or leaves you entrapped in matter. It's sort of analogous to Emet, which if you write that out, right, Aleph Mem Tav in Hebrew, that's truth. But if you take the Aleph away, it's like taking the breath of life out of it and you just have death. It's like Emet is no good without its Aleph. Well, LVX is no good without the L. And there was something else that made D kind of excited back in that LVX theorem with L, which was that it was a homophone, or Aleph Lamed, God Most High in Hebrew. There was also a mathematical transformation you could use it for, a lineus rectum, and we talked about that with parabolas. So anyway, we have LVX here. This, the pestle, is the L that goes with this V and X. Now we'll get back to delta. I'm giving you a capital delta here too, because it would just be implicit to him. It's a fire triangle. It's a fire triangle. Delta is associated with a fire triangle long before D's time. It's the Latin D. It's a homophone also with the Latin word for God. D. Maybe that's why John Dee enjoys writing his name as a delta so much later in Conversations with Angels. Who knows? The half moon there you can see is labeled delta. You can associate it with the fourth world. You can associate, although usually, of course, you do that with Hebrew letters, right? Yod, He, Vav, He, but you can associate it with the fourth world since he said he's associating it with Earth, and that's how it's associated in the letter Omega. It also looks like a reflecting mirror that focuses light, as I've said, so the light of the supernals has filtered down the middle pillar to Malkuth of Messiah. Is once you have propelled yourself up to Yesod of Messiah, it's starting to reflect the images of the divine. In fact, if you remember how you structured the tree and you associated Bina with the receptacle, and that is sending the form down the tree. I mean, and Saturn is associated with Bina. You can look at Yesod as a reflection of Bina. Okay, so once one starts this path of a chemical transformation, the idea is that the four elements start to separate out. Now we know from the Sefer Yetzirah that Earth is only in Malkuth. So again, we're talking about this little tree in Asaya, but the elements are starting to separate out. They've held the initiate in bondage in Malkuth of Asaya. Although it isn't in any way necessary, you can attribute the four elements the same way that Zosimos does in that on the letter Omega. One of the difficulties some people have with D is that he frequently changes, or a better word is transforms his attributions, okay? Directional and elemental. But you can attribute him just like in the letter of Omega if you want, and it'll be even clearer. But what really is helpful from that is to look at the ending where the spiritual man must get rid of his Adam, and you get this Greek interpretation of what Adam means. And one assumes you're getting rid of this Adam, the corporeal self, to merge with the higher self, since Jesus is coming down and taking up Adam, sort of like a similar process to what we had in Theorem 20. And then one might encounter the greater Adam, as we have previously talked about. But moving on. Okay, at the line closest to B here is another D. In effect, this D is reflecting the grades of the first grade of the moon past the midpoint, M. I'll say why I think it's the midpoint rather than it being important to attribute an element one way or the other in a minute. But it's almost to what would be the figure of Tifereth, or Tiferet, Kesed, Geburah, and Dot, if you want to look at the diagram as Mercury on the tree of life, or Tifereth and all the upper Sephiroth if you want to look at Venus on the tree of life. But remember this story from on the letter Omega of Phos and Photes. The idea is there that Adam realizes he's Phos. This is a word that in ancient Greek means both. It doesn't mean both, but it's a frequent play because they sound and are sound exactly alike, and they're spelled almost the same. It's used in Homer and so on, where light and man. So this light man is almost been freed from matter. All right, what about G and M? Well, G is the seventh letter in Latin, but in Greek, it corresponds to gamma in Greek, which is the third letter. And that's because gamma can also refer back to C and the way languages develop. So there are other places when you are reading back through the whole monad that if it is more helpful to make a C into a gamma, for example, you can do that. I mean, it's actually can be helpful in looking at that glyph in Theorem 21. It's derived from Phoenician gimel, just like the Hebrew letter gimel. Okay, so there's G. Well, how does that help us understand what this is in any way? Like this, if you just say G, you're saying the word in Greek for ye, earth, land, and soil. So we apply everything rather than something selectively, then D and G are the middle pillar in Asaya, earth becoming more progressively refined, because you still need earth in Asaya, right? There's this whole beautiful image you get in alchemy of the dew falling upon the earth so that things can grow up and the earth nourishing. All right, so Once the vessel starts the path of alchemical transformation, the four elements, which are actually elementatas for reasons I'll talk about in a minute. Remember, those are the primary substances like earth of earth, air of earth, water of earth. They start to separate out. How do we know that they're elementatas? Because we're in the world of Asaya. That's the only place that you have the element earth in the structure that Dee has set up here using the Sefer Yetzirah. And so you have the four elements in Malkuth. So we're looking at Malkuth attributed to earth and separating out earth of earth, water of earth, air of earth, fire of earth as you move up here. And by the time you get to D, you have the equivalent with Phos, um, a light body. But you still have light, okay, light, fire. It's still fire of earth because you're still in Asaya. The gap here is the displaced center of his rectilinear cross, like we've said a few times, the stone the builder rejected that we saw anointed and Tiphoretic in Theorem 20. And the knowledge is what you have been meditating upon, the signs and symbols that started the process to begin with, and whatever energetic practice one has, presumably. So that leaves us with M. M is a very special letter to D. He uses it a lot, particularly in another work of his, the Propoitomata Aphoristica, 120 aphorisms that he writes before the hieroglyphic monad, and then he revises it after, and then he inserts some Hebrew in it and some things that no one understands, although you can read it and understand it if you know the hieroglyphic monad. So in a key theorem there, he writes about the four Maiores Mundi Magnus Matricibus, or the four separate wombs of the larger world, emanated from one ray, rushing out to form spheres. Light rushing out in one ray might sound familiar to some of you. And you can equate also what he says there to the four worlds if you want to, but it's a fascinating theorem that people have puzzled over. The way he is using M here, just the way that Zosimos was using it in On the Letter Omega, is in effect he's found words that start with M in Latin and Greek that will correspond there. And since they work in English also, they're things like meridian. This meridianum in Latin, but this is a mu, which corresponds to M in Greek. The same is true with middle. So this is the midway point up. And in terms of what element you want to associate with each, if it's important, you can do it based on what we've said. If it's not, just consider it the midpoint. Another reason that M is important is, of course, the receptacle, or the third thing in the Timaeus, is called mother, with a word that begins with mu in the Timaeus. Hebrew mem is one of the three mother letters, the one most associated with water. Water is the universal solvent. You put something volatile in water and it becomes even more of a solvent. And this theorem is going to end with a puzzle about M, just by the way. Okay, so what we have here, let's sum it up. He said this many different ways, and now it's pretty clear. The four elements have held the initiate in the bondage of Malkuth of Asaya, wandering around in the darkness. Remember the ending On the Letter Omega. The spiritual man must get rid of his atom of the four elements to escape being their slave. The four elements have enslaved Adam. Add this to a Kabbalistic understanding that by doing this, he is becoming the greater Adam, maybe even Adam Kadmon, or in Zosimos's terms, he's realizing his true nature as Phos, which is man and light at the same time. In fact, there he's Thoth and Hermes, which is going to make the Mercury symbol even more important. Now we only need to do one more thing to understand this vessel and the process he's describing, and that's to look at the vessel over there on the far right, where alpha at the top, omega at the bottom are connected. We might want to ask why, other than the obvious I am the alpha and omega statement of Jesus, the anointed one, the Christos, and you are anointing yourself. So what is this vessel? What direction are the dots running? Well, we'd assume they're running down, but we don't really know that, except it looks like an apparatus that you would recognize if you were into physical alchemy. It looks like an apparatus for reflux distillation. And thanks to Alan Moore for pointing that out, since he's more into reflux distillation than I am. So the alpha drippings, in effect, are coming down here. That's the distillate. It's going back to the closed vessel and omega. Now, if you were really doing this, there would be a bunch of intermediate steps. So it's a kind of shorthand, but each time through, the distillate gets more and more refined. Also, the words reflux and flux both come from the same Latin word, fluxu, and we've seen Dee make poetic plays on that before, like back in Theorem 7, when he was talking about the elements and the outflowing of the four lines when you displaced this point. The outflowing, he compared their like being like drops in a river, and there's four rivers there. So one could equate that to four biblical rivers if one wanted. In effect, what you can do, though, with this whole graphic is look at it as an energy map for going through his two grades of the moon over and over and over again by circulating through this path over and over and over again, just like the fluid does or the water does in a reflux distilling apparatus. How do you do that? In meditation and incubation, by some other spiritual energetic practice. And then those crushed gemstones. If you put minerals in a strong solvent, as I've said before, let's take something like sulfuric acid. That's a really strong solvent. They'll dissolve. They'll become part of the metaphoric distillate. So in one sense, even the most alluring and precious part of Malkuth has to be destroyed, not really, refined, because it becomes part of the distillate if you merge his two ideas together here. Also, per Greco-Egyptian alchemy, you might use one of them to color something gold, but more importantly, you yourself are becoming gold. All right, so these are the things that we will do to determine his second grade of the moon, which is an artificial solar grade. Okay, so if we put Venus on the tree of life, you're going up through the remainder of the tree in Asaya, because that's going to have the remaining Sephiroth. But if you use Mercury, you are going up 4 grades in effect. And that was what we had in his first grade of the moon. The thing is, he never actually says there's 4 grades of this second grade or this solar grade of the moon. And the trouble is, if you use Mercury, it makes it hard to overlap the trees into the Yetziratic, as I'll talk a bit about later on. On the other hand, if you do that and there's 4 grades, then it might correspond really well. In fact, it does correspond really well with some things about the riddle of the Sphinx said by Eliphas Levi, but Levi is 2 centuries after Dee. So I'm just going to leave that as kind of an open question, though I'll be treating it as Venus on the tree of life. Mercury is what the entire monad glyph represents. And yes, it's Mercury on the tree of life. It's just slightly different from the usual representation used by Hermeticists in that it has those little Aries things at the bottom. So if you want to study this more, go back to Theorems 13 and 14 and the homework that you did for those and for 15. And remember the graphic in 13 where he had all those planetary glyphs. I showed it earlier in this video and how they were mirroring each other and mirroring something that looks like the monad that was in the center. And in fact, rotating around there, you get a circle and you can even get a sphere, the perfect form. Anyway, so now you have Dee's energy map for the 2 grades of the moon. After this, the chart in this theorem ought to be relatively easy to understand. So try it as homework for this very packed theorem, and also try to draw Mercury on the tree of life upside down. We're going to top off our discussion of 22 in the next video with some puzzles in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and then we're going to come back in the final video to check homework, look at Dee's final comments, and that'll also in both of the next 2 videos, give us an idea of what his course of study actually is beyond all of the stuff that you've had to understand to get this far. Because he's charting out a course of study. So we want to look at what that implies. Okay, I'll have the next video out on those word puzzles within a day or 2. So see you then. Bye-bye.